Good morning. It's great to be here. So first part of the discussion is, as a community, we really struggle with it. And what is it? I mean, we have a hard time embracing the concept of wildfire, and especially when we start talking about wildfire with benefits. And it seems to be an internal problem, not an external problem. It's not a problem with the public. It's a problem with our own internal communication. Tim went over the policy, and one thing that stands out with the policy, and as Elizabeth Reinhardt said in the plenary session, it is good policy. It's solid policy. It really allows us to look at fire across the landscape. It gives us a flexibility as the fire situation evolves and as the environment changes to change or modify our objectives. It allows us to manage for the use of wildfire to achieve benefits. This is a sort of a quick slide that sort of gets at the heart of the policy and why, from a terminology perspective, I don't think it's a problem with terms. It's a problem with the legacy, and it's a cultural problem of how we've perceived our terms. Because the policy itself is very clear. We have wildfire and prescribed fire. Those are the two types of fire we have. Unplanned, planned. We have different ignition sources for those. But the key thing here in the wildfire is you have resource, you can manage that fire or achieve resource benefit. You can also have protection objectives to prevent damage, loss, and harm. And that can be from a human-caused fire within the Park Service, lightning-caused, Forest Service can be a lightning-caused fire. Not only that, as the fire progresses, that can be changed. It's all anchored in land management objectives. In DOI, and Tim alluded to that, Forest Service too, we love counting acres. We try to get across, well, what are we achieving on the landscape? How are these wildfires benefiting our landscapes? We count those acres. We grab those acres. We don't necessarily define exactly what they are, but we see that as a way to convince the public, convince Congress that we're achieving something out there. However, even in our desire to count and understand our landscape and how our landscape is being treated by wildfires, a number of presentations here has made a clear point that wildfire, especially in the West, is what treats our landscapes. We still have confusion in the terminology. We have difficulty understanding and grasping it in terms of benefits. And as Tim went over in his discussion, how the changes in 2009 with the federal fire policy guidance tried to address that. Even with those changes, you'd think we have a clear definition of wildfire within the federal policy. But then when we look at our NWCG glossary, we have a nice definition of wildland fire. We have the two different types of fire, prescribed fire, wildfire. But you look at wildfire, it's an unplanned, that's consistent with policy, unwanted. Well, here we're talking today about how we need wildfire to manage to achieve benefits, how we have wildfire that really is managing our western landscapes. And we're saying the bulk of them in our definition is unwanted, which is inconsistent with policy. Then we go a little bit further and say, hey, God, that definition is still under review. So we're in an industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry driven by wildfire, and we don't even have a clear definition. So we're making progress. You go further, you look at the NWCG glossary, terms. You can look at, we have the term prescribed fire, wildland fire. You can see, if you get in the glossary, you see 5 different terms that start with prescribed, 10 different terms that start with wildland fire. Luckily, we only have 2 terms that have wildfire in it, and one of them is the term wildfire. And the reason why I say luckily is we have an incomplete definition. So at least working within that incomplete definition, it's not affecting our other terms out there. And that's not right. Historically, we look at the origin of wildfire. My God, it's an old English word. It's been around for a long time. And I guarantee back then, they weren't struggling with the meaning of it. They grasped it. They knew from their perspective, originally it was reference to spreading skin disease, but then finally we moved up to say it's a destructive fire. The concept, the definition, it was there. Prescribed fire, relatively recent term, wildland fire, even more recent term. One side note is what we'd like to see where it says destructive fire for wildfire, 12th century. It'd be nice to see beneficial fire, 20th century. So we can finally get that dichotomy of the struggle we have with wildfire, that it's both protection and for benefit, where you actually put it into our English and maintain it. It becomes part of the origin of the word. It has strength, it has meaning. As Tim showed in his Google search, and the endless struggle we have with the different terminology, recent terms, managed fire, the other one is, I don't know, where is it up there? Wildfire used as prescribed fire. That's been kicked out a few times. Think of that. So we're trying to convey to public meaning with that. And we struggle over that. Another way to look at it is, through my career, I started out with the formerly known as Prescribed Fire Support Crew, which became the Wildland Fire Module. So you can see there, Park Service started the Prescribed Fire Support Crew in 1995. And that was really in reaction to managing prescribed natural fire, because under the 90s definition, prescribed meant prescribed natural fire and management ignited prescribed fire. And we struggled whether we're a crew, a team, a support module. Finally, we coalesced around module, but then we still had to struggle with the term wildland fire use. Finally, a wildland fire module, which basically says it doesn't matter about the fire type. We're here to support the outcomes of a wildfire, prescribed fire. It doesn't matter. That's what we're there to do. It also was a great boom for the t-shirt industry, because every year we had to change the t-shirts. Another way to look at it is, what does land have to say about wildfire? So this is looking at the broader Glacier National Park ecosystem. You see over close to 6,000 starts there. The majority of those are wildfire, some up in Canada. I don't know if they just use the term wildfire, if they have other terms. And you see a broader way. So you can look at that. Most of those are, I'd say probably 99% of those are wildfires, none of them are prescribed fires. If we drill in there, we can see the landscape that we're talking about. So you can look at from 1984, looking at the burn severity up to 2009, you can see a large area that has been treated. You can see that not only are these wildfires treating landscape, you can see this fire down here, you can see this fire up in Canada, and you can see that Canada likes to mimic our shape of fires, but that's all right, we'll accept it. And we can see across the landscape mixed severity. Well, if we drill in a little further and start saying, well, what about the fire type? What about it, the fire name? So I was going to play Name That Fire. So go back to 1994. If we look at this fire, there's a couple of us in this room who actually were on this fire. I'll go to one. What is this fire called right here, 1994? And I'll look at Ron out there. It's the howling, but what type of fire?
Prescribed natural.
Yes, prescribed natural fire, howling fire. But what's even weird about it's a prescribed natural fire, but above it, after this little neck here, these are wildfires. So it's a prescribed natural fire being contained by wildfire because of the conditions we could not call the whole thing a prescribed natural fire. Concurrently, we had a wildfire going on. Okay? Looking at the graphs and severity, they're very similar. You can say, God, that's red up there, a lot of high severity. Well, that's because it went into Canada. And if you look down here, a big patch up here, well, that's because it's a steep slope. And so it's not the fire type, it's how the land is being treated. And it's actually what Tim was saying, it's how the objectives are being defined. And that's where we need to be clear. So what I did was, it is really about the objectives. It is wildfire, okay? That's what it is. We can be clear about that. But what are we doing when we're managing those fires, and how do we communicate that? And I think that was a key point Elizabeth made in her presentation. Our fire policy is good. Our fire policy is flexible. It's about public support. Well, how do you garner public support if you're not articulating your objectives? And where does that articulation occur? It can go on Facebook, it can go through town meetings and so on, but also you can look across INSEWeb as a source for understanding that. And what I'm finding is this real mixed bag of how objectives articulated or are linked to it. So you can see this is a full suppression fire, not a partial suppression fire, not an incomplete suppression fire, not a haphazard suppression fire, it's a full suppression fire. So that gets back to our terminology. It's a suppression fire. but it doesn't really state what that means, what we're trying to achieve. The other thing to look at that is it's 38,000 acres, Beaver Creek fire in Colorado. It's a long duration fire. This fire started, what does it say there, in July, okay, July. And we have the ability to shift our objectives. So at times there's public values, private values, our own federal values that are at risk, that we don't want to have harm. But rarely do you see a change in objectives as the strategy is moving forward. And as Tim said, for the Forest Service, it depends on the cause of the fire. But look, that's a long duration, $30 million fire. It's not doing all bad on the landscape. I'll make some further points on that. Sobranos fire, another great example. 132,000 acres, $250 million, another long duration fire, went on for months. Some of it in a wilderness area. What's articulated is more about the overview of the fire, not necessarily specific objectives. And what's even worse is it takes us to our terminology too, and if you look up wildfire, we got a problem there. We don't have a complete definition. And this other side, the links really take you to things that are supportive for the explaining how we manage our fire, land management goals, objectives, explanations of the fire, and really it's more operationally focused. It doesn't really help the public. Pioneer fire, similar example, 95 million, 180,000, nothing really about the objectives, nothing going linking to explain more about the fire. This one I like, Southeastern fire, Rock Mountain fires, NC Web right there. Clear articulation of their objectives right in NC Web, so the public knows what it's about. People can find that information. We look at what we call the fire for benefits. Fuller fire, Grand Canyon, managed for benefits. What's really neat about this, and this is where the Park Service is doing an excellent job, within NC Web it's not talking about the objectives, but there's links here that first take you to Grand Canyon Fire Management Program website, which does a very good job defining its land management objectives, explaining about its program, explaining how it approaches fire. Then it has a story map that tells about the Fuller fire and starts getting in the ecological side, the objectives of what they're trying to do and the issues that they're facing as they're trying to manage this fire. Yellowstone fires. This year, Yellowstone, 65,000 acres burned that were, I'll say, was 65,000 acres of wildfire that did have resource benefits. Objectives are articulated on some of these links from NC Web. Here's one, strategy, allow fire to play a natural role in fire. Other key thing is you can link off, and the Park Service does a great job, where you can go to their websites and once again find out about the land management, about the goals, the objectives of what we're trying to achieve on the land with fire. And that's mixed. It's both the benefits and dealing with possible harm and loss of resources. Berry fire right in there, another fire right there. It's clear what the management objectives are. And that's what Tim was getting at, and this is where I sort of get caught up on. It's about the wildfire and defining what we're doing on the landscape. We don't need to say it's a wildfire for resource objectives, multiple objectives, wildfire use, wildfire for natural benefits. We need to say specifically what we're trying to achieve on the ground. And if we start looking at the incident management plan, I just grabbed a few. I'm a SOPO. Recent fires I've been on, and this is a Halstead fire up near Stanley, Idaho, 81,000 acres, about $50 million. This is another long duration fire. And when we start looking at the landscape, when we start saying wildfires treat our landscapes, there's a lot of benefits going on there. Still, within that policy of the Forest Service, you're not seeing after month 2 or 6 weeks a change where there's areas within that fire that are managed for objectives, for resource benefits. We can put that in. We need to make that change. We need to have that flexibility. And if we start using our objectives to describe what we can do, we can communicate to the public. If we start using our objectives to describe what we do, we can communicate to the people on the incidents. And we can also start holding our fire management teams to manage the fire how we want that landscape to be managed. Another example, Cougar Creek Fire, this on the base of Mount Adams in Oregon. Great fire. One thing nice to note here, just very clear objectives. And Druid Complex of Fires, note that you see minimize risk, plan for protection strategies, but also resource management objectives. And finally, just to close out here, back to this slide, as I said, that it is wildfire. We need to describe their objectives and benefits. One thing Brian Rice was asked is what type of Christmas present for research he would like. And Brian said he would like to know the true cost of a fire. And I would say what I'd like to know is, and that true cost of fire is the benefits that we're achieving on the landscape through wildfire, and how to start quantifying it and understanding that it. Thank you.